I sat quietly at the grand opening my own son hosted with the money I had saved over 40 years. He took it all, and even forged my name to secure a bank loan. He stood there giving a speech like a hero until I raised a folder and exposed everything. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch more jaw-dropping stories like this. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. A cold drizzle smeared across the windows of the ward house like tears that refused to dry. Inside, the air still carried the scent of lilies from the funeral, thick, sweet, and suffocating. They lined the hallway, the living room, even the edge of the kitchen table, brought by friends and neighbors who didn't know what else to do or say to a newly widowed woman. Annalise Ward sat on the edge of her late husband's leather reading chair, the one he never let anyone else touch. Her hands were folded in her lap, stiff and cold, her shoulders pulled in like she was trying to shrink into herself. She was still wearing black, though the funeral was yesterday. She hadn't found the strength or the reason to change. The house was quiet, too quiet. Richard's deep laugh used to fill the halls. Now it felt like a museum of ghosts. 62. That's how old she was now. Too young to be a proper widow, too old to start again. For the last 36 years, she'd been Mrs. Richard Ward, homemaker, mother, caregiver, wife. Now, she didn't know what she was anymore. The fire in the hearth had burned down to smoldering embers. Outside, dusk fell in slow gray sheets, blanketing the world in shadows. Annalise finally moved, dragging her feet toward Richard's old desk in the study. His desk was untouched, exactly as he'd left it, pen angled perfectly beside a leather notebook, a stack of financial folders clipped shut with military precision. She opened the top drawer and pulled out the small black key. The safe behind the bookshelf responded with its familiar click, revealing a neat stack of documents and a small leather portfolio marked Ward Family Trust. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for it. Inside was everything. The will, the trust agreement power of attorney paperwork Richard had prepared meticulously. She remembered him sitting down with her 2 years ago, insisting they review every clause. "So you won't be lost if anything happens," he'd said, brushing her hand with quiet reassurance. She hadn't been paying attention then. It felt theoretical, like fire drills or earthquake plans. You never think it's really going to happen. But now Richard was gone, a heart attack in his sleep. No warnings, no goodbyes. Her eyes scanned the bank account summary stapled to the back of the trust agreement. Her breath caught in her throat. One of the retirement accounts, the joint fund they'd spent a lifetime building, was missing $97,386. She blinked, looked again. No, it wasn't a mistake. March 3rd, that was the withdrawal date. Annalise sat down heavily at the desk, the leather creaking under her weight. Her mind raced. She hadn't touched that account. It was strictly for retirement. Richard had always insisted on that. Emergency funds only, never for daily expenses. But the withdrawal was real, and it was recent. She reached for her laptop, fingers cold against the keyboard, and logged into the bank portal. There it was again, in bold black text: wire transfer, 97,386.74, Caleb Ward, investment transfer. Caleb. Her heart sank as her cursor hovered over the transaction. Her only child, her son, her everything. Caleb had always been smart, charming, persuasive. He was the kind of boy who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket, who had once convinced his 4th-grade teacher to let him retake a test just because he felt spiritually unprepared the first time. She'd always told people he had his father's eyes and her quick wit. She had always been proud of him, but now her memory conjured something else 3 weeks ago, just before Richard passed. Caleb had called. She remembered the conversation vividly because his voice had been trembling, uncharacteristically fragile. "Mom, I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent. I swear to you," he'd said. She had stepped out into the garden, one hand cradling the phone, the other brushing the peonies Richard had planted last spring. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Caleb had hesitated. Then came the story, his voice cracking in all the right places. He was working on something big, a project that could change lives. He and a group of partners were starting a center for elder wellness, combining healthcare with dignity, comfort, and holistic therapy. "It's everything you and Dad used to talk about," he said. "A place where people can grow old without feeling forgotten." Annalise had smiled through her tears, then touched by the thought. "But I'm short on the upfront capital," he'd continued. "Investors won't come in unless I can show personal stake. I thought of using my savings, but the baby's due in a few months and Melissa's been sick again." That's when the hook landed. "I hate asking, Mom. Truly. But is there any way I can get temporary access to the trust? Just to show liquidity to the investors, I'll pay it back the moment funding clears, a month tops." Annalise had felt her heart ache. Caleb had always been ambitious, but this sounded like legacy, like purpose, like the kind of thing Richard would have supported without hesitation. "Only temporary," she'd asked. "I promise." She'd agreed. Not instantly. She'd asked for time to think, slept on it, even called Clarice her friend since college, and the only one who'd dare question her decisions. Clarice had been wary. "Just be careful," she said. "Temporary can turn permanent real fast in the world of family and finances." But Annalise had overruled her instincts. She called the bank, signed the temporary authorization, and gave Caleb access to the trust account. It had felt like an act of love. Now, staring at the transaction, she wondered if it had been an act of foolishness instead. The money was gone, not partially, not drawn in increments, gone all at once. Her eyes blurred with tears, but her jaw tightened. She clicked through to the account history. No deposits, no repayments, no emails from Caleb explaining anything. Nothing but that single gut punch transaction. She leaned back in Richard's chair, and it suddenly felt cold, foreign. She pressed her palms to her temples and tried to breathe. It had only been 2 days since they lowered Richard into the ground. 2 days of casseroles and condolences. 2 days of people telling her she was strong, that she'd get through this. But no one had prepared her for this feeling, the sharp, sickly suspicion that your own child might have lied to you. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from Caleb. "Hey, Mom, thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything. We're here for you, okay?" She stared at the message, typed, erased, typed again, then put the phone down without responding. "We're here for you." Was he? Or had he been there just long enough to get what he wanted? The wind howled outside, a low moan against the windows. Annalise rose, moved toward the fireplace, and stared into the dying flames. She thought of Richard, his strong hands, the way he always balanced optimism with caution. "What would you do?" she whispered aloud. But the room remained silent. Annalise turned back to the desk. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write. A date, a dollar amount, a name. Then she drew a line across the page and wrote in capital letters, "Find the truth." The warmth that had always filled their home seemed gone now, replaced by a cold determination that spread from her fingertips to her chest. She would find out where that money had gone. She would find out why her son had lied. And if it was betrayal, she would face it not as a grieving widow, not as a gullible mother, but as a woman who refused to let her love be turned into currency. The storm outside grew stronger, but Annalise Ward, for the first time in weeks, felt strangely still. The ocean breeze had always brought Annalise a strange sort of comfort, cool, briny, full of memories. She used to come here with Richard during spring weekends, winding down the old coastal highway, just for the view. It had been nearly a year since their last drive together, but the habit remained. So that Wednesday morning, feeling overwhelmed by the heavy quiet of the house, she'd decided to take the car out and head for the sea. The roads were familiar, narrow, 2-lane stretches, bordered by pine groves and cliffs, postcard perfect. The town of Seaborough lay just 20 miles from her doorstep, nestled against the Pacific, like a secret someone had whispered to her long ago. Its boardwalk bookstores and seafood shacks had played supporting roles in countless chapters of her married life. Richard had loved the clam chowder at Marlin's. She'd loved the antique store with the faded blue awning where she once found a porcelain teacup set for a quarter of its value. But as she drove past the turnoff for the marina, something caught her eye. A house? No. A mansion perched on a slight hill overlooking the bay. It hadn't been there the last time she passed. Or if it had been abandoned, hidden beneath wild ivy and neglect. Now it was under full renovation, brand new windows gleaming in the sunlight, fresh white paint covering its broad, clappered siding, scaffolding hugging the corners like exoskeletons. Workmen were laying stones along the walkway, and a banner stretched between two temporary pillars read in elegant serif lettering, "Ward Wellness Resort, coming soon." The tires of her car crunched the gravel shoulder as she pulled over. She didn't even realize she had stopped the engine. Ward. The name rang in her ears like a bell that wouldn't quiet. Not just the name itself, but the font, the color, the specific brand blue Richard had always used on the family's letterhead. The subtle wave graphic below it, Caleb's idea from years ago when he'd helped rebrand Richard's financial consulting firm. It was all too precise to be coincidence. She stared at the banner like it was written in fire. Before she could think, her hand was already reaching for her door handle. She stepped out, the sea breeze tugging at her coat. The salt in the air no longer felt comforting, it stung. And then she saw it. Parked in front of the newly paved driveway just beyond the rows of blooming hydrangeas that hadn't been there a month ago was Caleb's silver Audi. Its license plate still read Ward Jr., a not-so-subtle nod to his role as the only son. She froze. Every part of her body seemed to go still at once, like prey spotting danger it hadn't expected. Then the front door opened. Out walked Caleb, laughing, tossing a key ring in the air. Beside him, Melissa, his wife, in a flowing linen dress and oversized sunglasses, clung to his arm. They didn't look like people in financial crisis. They didn't look like parents struggling with hospital bills or investment anxiety. They looked successful, effortlessly happy, partners in ambition. Melissa leaned up and kissed Caleb's cheek. He wrapped an arm around her waist, still grinning, then pointed toward the bay as if giving a tour. Annalise's heart dropped slow and heavy. She ducked back into the car like a thief, pulling the door shut as softly as she could. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. The windows were slightly tinted, but she still angled herself to avoid being seen. Her breath came short and shallow. Her son was standing in front of a seaside estate with a custom sign bearing their family name. The same son who had just emptied her joint retirement account with a trembling voice and promises of elder care innovation. She hadn't seen any business permits, no architectural plans, no website, no proposal packets. Just this, a sleek banner, a luxurious renovation, and Caleb looking like a man who had everything he wanted. She turned the key in the ignition and eased the car back onto the road. The wheels rolled slowly, then faster as she made her way back toward town, each mile feeling heavier than the last. She didn't go home right away. She parked by the beach instead, just past the dunes where the seagrass bent under the weight of the wind. Her hands rested motionless on the wheel for a long while before she finally reached into her purse and pulled out a small spiral-bound notebook. It was the one she used to keep grocery lists, recipes, notes to herself. She opened to a fresh page and wrote in bold letters at the top, "Timeline." Then below it, Feb 25. Richard's collapse, Feb 26. Hospital admission, Feb 27. Richard passes. March 3rd. Caleb requests temporary trust access. March 5th, authorization granted. March 6th, 97, 386.74 wired to Caleb. April 14th today. Sees Caleb and Melissa outside fully renovated coastal property. Banner Ward Wellness Resort. Coming soon. She stared at the list. The dates lined up too perfectly. Richard's body hadn't even been cremated before Caleb had made his request. Barely a week later, the money was gone. She turned the page and began listing questions. Who owns the property? When was it purchased? What is the nature of the resort? Is there a business license? Any investors' partners? Who paid for the renovation? Her pen moved faster than her thoughts. Notes turned to bullet points, then diagrams. She began outlining connections. Caleb's job, his contacts, a vague memory of him mentioning an architect friend last Christmas. The wind rattled the window slightly, pulling her from her trance. She looked up at the horizon. The ocean hadn't changed, still vast, still cold, but the sky was darker now. By the time she got home, it was after 6 p.m. The sun had dipped low, casting a copper glow across the hardwood floors of the foyer. She didn't take off her coat. Instead, she went straight to the dining room where Richard used to do the taxes. She laid out her notebook, her laptop, and the trust papers. Then she opened a new spreadsheet. File name Caleb Timeline. LSX. She began entering the data systematically, dates, amounts, sources. Every transaction, every phone call, every lie. She pulled up her email inbox and searched Caleb. There were dozens of messages, birthday greetings, photos of the kids, requests for recipes. But now seen through this new lens, even his casual messages felt strategic. Like breadcrumbs in a trail she hadn't known she was following. The call log showed that on March 6th, just 3 hours after the wire transfer, Caleb had spoken to a number she didn't recognize. She wrote it down and highlighted it. Melissa had sent a thank you text on March 7th, "You're the best mom. Caleb is so grateful. He'll make you proud, promise." Her stomach turned. She clicked through her calendar reminders. Caleb had declined the memorial planning meeting on March 10th, citing work deadlines. That was likely around the time the property was being purchased. She Googled the name Ward Wellness Resort. Nothing, not yet. But when she searched the town's property database, her breath caught. The address matched the one she'd passed that morning. Owner Seaborough Ventures, LLC registered agent Caleb R. Ward. It had been purchased on February 28th, the day after Richard died. Her hand trembled slightly. She clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. He hadn't just lied, he hadn't just used her. He had already planned it before his father's body was cold. The fire in her chest was no longer grief. It was something sharper, angrier. She stood up slowly, turned on every light in the room, and walked to the coat closet. Inside on the top shelf was a cardboard box labeled Richard, 2021 tax. She pulled it down, brought it to the table, and began searching for their previous investment reports. If Caleb had used any portion of Richard's assets, IRA funds, business equities, she'd find it here. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., she was still searching. The house was no longer quiet. The air buzzed with the sound of truth crawling out from its corners. She would follow every breadcrumb. She would unravel every thread. And when the time came, she would look her son in the eyes and make him see exactly what he had done. Clarice always picked up on the second ring. No matter the time of day, no matter what she was doing. It was a reflex, a muscle memory forged from years of being the one person everyone called when the truth became too heavy to carry alone. "Annalise," she said, voice warm but sharp, like the rim of a whiskey glass. "How are you holding up?" There was a long pause before Annalise spoke. "Can I come over?" Clarice didn't ask questions. She just said, "Yes, now's good." Annalise didn't remember the drive to Clarice's house, only the pressure in her chest that seemed to grow with every mile. Clarice lived in a narrow 3-story brownstone near the old downtown district. Her home was a collage of books, old photos, and political posters from an era that had promised change but delivered little. It smelled like ink, citrus, and memory. Clarice opened the door before Annalise had even knocked. She wore a flannel shirt over a T-shirt that read, "Journalism is printing what someone else doesn't want printed," and jeans with a tear on the knee. Her gray-streaked hair was twisted into a careless bun. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw Annalise's face. "You brought the storm with you," she murmured, stepping aside. They sat in Clarice's kitchen, mugs of strong coffee between them, the steam curling like nervous breath. Annalise laid it all out. Caleb's call, the trust transfer, the seaside mansion with the family name plastered across the banner like some cruel joke. The notebook came out next, its pages now filled with dates, transactions, and crossed-out names. Clarice didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when Annalise finally said, "I think I've been conned by my own son," she nodded once like she'd been expecting it all along. "We'll start with property records," Clarice said, her voice shifting into gear. "Seaborough County Recorder's Office has a decent online system. If that land was bought or mortgaged, it'll be in there." She turned her laptop toward Annalise's fingers already flying across the keys. "You trust me with this?" she asked without looking up. Annalise stared at her for a long second. Then quietly, "With this, I trust no one more." Within minutes, Clarice had pulled up a list of recent property transfers in the Seaborough area. She scrolled through legal descriptions, parcel numbers, and chain of title documents like a surgeon opening a chest cavity. "There it is," she said, tapping the screen. "Property lot. 14B, Seaborough Bluffs. Owner, Seaborough Ventures, LLC mortgage lender, Maritime First Capital Loan. Amount, $250,000. Date recorded, March 8th. Authorized signatories, Caleb R. Ward, Annalise B. Ward." The cursor hovered over Annalise's name. Clarice sat back slowly. "You said you never signed anything beyond the trust account, right?" "Never. Not a thing. Richard always handled the legal stuff. I only signed what he told me to." Clarice leaned forward again, clicked a link that led to the scanned mortgage documents. And there it was. Page 4, bottom right corner, 2 signatures side by side. One said Caleb R. Ward, bold and slanted, just like the birthday cards he'd written since he was 12. The other, Annalise B. Ward, neat, elegant, a near-perfect replica of her handwriting. Annalise's heart began to race. That's not mine." Clarice zoomed in. "It looks damn close." "But it's not." Annalise said, her voice rising. "I never signed this. I didn't even know about the land. That's Richard's parcel. He inherited it from his uncle before we married." Clarice stared at the screen a long moment. Then she stood, went to the cabinet, and pulled out a small magnifying glass. She placed it against the screen. "The line pressure's off. See the hesitation in the W. Whoever did this traced it. Not by hand, probably software assisted." She closed the laptop with a quiet thud. "Annalise, this is forgery, and not just any kind. This is federal." The words fell like stones into the room. Annalise looked down at her hands. They were trembling again. "I wanted to believe him," she whispered. "When he said it was for something good, for elders, people like me, people like Richard would have been." Clarice softened. She reached across the table, covered Annalise's hand with her own. "You're a mother. You believed in your son. That's not a crime." "But what he did is," Annalise said, her voice suddenly steady. There was silence, thick and ringing. Clarice reached for her phone. "I have a contact at Maritime First. Let me ask her to pull the origination documents." Annalise blinked. "Won't that raise red flags?" Clarice smiled grimly. "It should." While Clarice typed out a message, Annalise sat back in her chair, replaying the signature in her mind. She thought of all the times she'd signed her name on field trip forms, on birthday checks, on permission slips, on the mortgage papers for Caleb's first home, a home she'd paid the down payment on. He had watched her write that name for years, memorized the loops, the slant, the rhythm. That was the part that broke her. It wasn't a stranger's scam. It wasn't a mistake. It was Caleb, her son, her flesh and blood. He'd known exactly how to make it look real because he'd seen her do it 1,000 times. Clarice's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then at Annalise. "Confirmed. Mortgage loan initiated March 6th, same day you transferred the trust funds. The paperwork included notarized identity verification for both of you." Annalise shook her head in disbelief. "Notarized? Could be someone paid off, or someone forged the notary stamp. Happens more than you'd think. But the point is, he planned all of this. It wasn't spontaneous, it was coordinated." Annalise felt something tear inside her, like a seam long ignored finally giving way. She stood up, walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind thick clouds. A crow landed on the railing of Clarice's porch, cocked its head, and let out a single caw. "I didn't just lose Richard," she said softly. "I think I lost my son, too." Clarice didn't argue. She didn't offer platitudes. She just poured another cup of coffee and said, "You're not losing your sanity. That's important. This is real, and we're going to get to the bottom of it." Annalise turned, her face composed but pale. "What happens now?" Clarice picked up her notebook. "Now, we gather everything, every document, every email, every message. You back up your files, print hard copies, and keep a folder somewhere safe. We treat this like a crime scene because that's what it is." Annalise nodded, the weight of the moment settling into her spine like armor. Clarice continued, "You'll need to find your original signature samples, old tax filings, wills, signed checks, anything we can compare." "I still have our 2019 tax return," Annalise said, "signed by both of us." Perfect, that'll be our control. There was a pause. Clarice stood up and looked directly into her eyes. You know what this could mean, don't you? Annalise nodded slowly. That he might go to jail, and that your relationship with him may not survive. There was no hesitation this time. He made that choice. I just didn't see it until now. Clarice looked at her old friend for a long moment. Then she walked over and pulled her into a hug. I'm sorry it's him, she whispered, but I'm proud it's you. Annalise closed her eyes, let herself be held. The old grief still throbbed Richard's absence, the house too quiet, the ghost of birthdays yet to come. But layered on top of that now was something different, not rage, not vengeance, resolve. When she stepped back into her car an hour later, the notebook resting beside her, she felt different. Like someone who had been sleepwalking and finally opened her eyes. She turned the key in the ignition. She wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was a woman on the trail of the truth. And nothing, not even the blood tie of motherhood, was going to stop her from finding it. It was a gray Thursday when Caleb showed up at her door. No call, no text. Just the sound of his Audi pulling into the driveway and the casual slam of his car door, like nothing in the world had changed. Annalise watched him from behind the curtain. His posture was just off shoulders, hunched slightly forward, hands tucked deep into his coat pockets, as if rehearsing sorrow. It was the kind of body language Caleb had perfected in college, when trying to convince professors for deadline extensions or police officers for warnings instead of tickets. She didn't flinch when the doorbell rang. She waited. 3 seconds, then opened the door. Hi, Mom. His voice was quiet, a practiced softness. He leaned in arms open. She offered only a one-armed hug and a neutral Caleb. He stepped inside like he owned the air in the room, took off his coat, glanced around as if expecting to find some echo of his father's presence. How are you holding up? He asked. I'm managing, she said, closing the door. He nodded, looked down, then gave a slow sigh. Things have been really hard lately. Oh, yeah, the project's been stalled. He sat on the edge of the armchair, not quite relaxed. We've been waiting on zoning approvals. The city's being ridiculous. Delays, legal stuff. We're barely hanging on. Annalise said nothing, just raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed over her chest. Caleb continued, tone carefully calibrated. I didn't want to bother you. I know you're grieving, but it's been hard. I thought we'd be open by now, but everything's up in the air. She stared at him. You have a banner already. He blinked. What? The Ward Wellness Resort coming soon banner, she said. I saw it. His face froze for just a second too long. Oh, he chuckled nervously. Right. Marketing's ahead of operations, I guess. Her lips thinned, but she didn't push further. Would you like some coffee? God, yes. She turned into the kitchen. This was her chance. The black digital recorder she'd picked up the day before was small, smaller than her car key fob. Clarice had helped her program it, set it to voice-activated mode high sensitivity. It was wrapped in a strip of black tape to look like a USB charger. She walked back in and handed Caleb a ceramic mug with one hand, while the other casually dropped the device into the side pocket of his coat, which was draped over the edge of the couch. She smiled faintly. It's good to see you. You too, Mom, he said, sipping. I've missed this place. She nodded, folding into the silence. He stayed for exactly 27 minutes, long enough to say he cared, long enough to act like he was still the dutiful son. But he didn't ask about Richard's favorite watch, didn't mention the trust, didn't offer a word about the funds. When he left, Annalise walked him out to his car. Drive safe, she said. I always do. He winked. Before starting the engine classic, Caleb's smug self assured the world always one lie behind him. The recorder would tell her the rest. 2 hours later, Clarice came over. They sat together at Annalise's kitchen table, with the recorder placed between them like a loaded gun. Annalise pressed play. The first 10 minutes were nothing. The hum of traffic, the click of his phone unlocking, a few mumbles. Then a name. Marcia. Hey, sorry I'm late, just leaving my mom's. Clarice leaned in. Annalise froze. A pause. Then Caleb's voice dropped into his business tone, the one he used in negotiations, all casual power. Yeah, it's done. She's completely out of the loop. Pause. No, she has no idea we're planning to flip the property. I stuck with the wellness pitch. She ate it up. Clarice's eyes went wide. I know, but trust me, it's better this way. If we try to pitch it as a boutique rental from the start, she'll ask questions. This way she thinks we're doing something noble." He laughed. "We're already fielding offers. One guy from Santa Barbara is talking 7 figures if we guarantee exclusivity. And if we close by July, the bonus clause kicks in." Annalise closed her eyes. The voice continued. She was sniffing a little. "Asked about the banner, but I covered it. Honestly, the old lady doesn't want drama. She just wants peace and sympathy. I give her both." There was a long silence. Clarice's mouth had turned into a thin line, her jaw set. The tape continued. "Yeah, Melissa's nervous, but she'll get over it once the wire hits. I told her worst case, we just move the LLC into her name. Mom won't sue. She's not built like that." Click. Silence. Annalise reached forward and pressed stop. The room was quiet again. Clarice sat back in her chair, exhaled. "He's selling the house." Annalise didn't answer. "He's going to flip the entire thing. After gutting your retirement. After using your name to fake a loan. Now he's going to walk away with $1 million profit." Annalise's voice was even too even. "He thinks I won't sue." Clarice leaned forward. "You will." Annalise nodded. But it wasn't the words Caleb had used that hurt the most, it was the tone. The cold efficiency. The condescension. The way he called her the old lady, like she was a stranger, like she was already buried next to Richard. This wasn't just betrayal. This was erasure. He had rewritten her as a gullible obstacle, an afterthought, a stepping stone. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the yard Richard had once planted with wild roses. He'd trusted Caleb. They both had. And now Caleb had put their name on a house just to sell it for profit, like some family legacy was just a tool to prop open a door to money. She turned back to Clarice. "We build a case." Clarice nodded. "I know a guy. Former fraud investigator. Now runs private consults. He'll verify the forged signature. And I'll talk to a couple of real estate lawyers. See if we can freeze the property pending a civil inquiry." Annalise picked up the recorder and slid it into her pocket. "Tomorrow," she said. "We start tomorrow." Clarice looked at her old friend, studied the fire returning to her eyes. "You ready for war?" Annalise's voice didn't waver. "I buried my husband. I buried my peace. I won't bury the truth." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The day was getting darker. But inside the kitchen, something sharper than grief had taken hold. Caleb had gambled everything on the idea that his mother was soft. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The next morning came with no sunlight, just a thick, overcast sky that hung low over the rooftops like a lid sealing in all the unease. Annalise sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of black coffee untouched. The steam had long since disappeared. Before her lay a legal pad filled with scribbled questions, printed screenshots, and a highlighter that had already run dry. Each word on the page bled with betrayal dates, amounts, phrases Caleb had spoken with the ease of someone who thought lies were love in disguise. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice again. "The old lady doesn't want drama." That voice, sharp with arrogance, had twisted itself around her heart like a thorned vine. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Clarice texted, "Found something. You need to see this. Be there in 20. When the knock came, Annalise opened the door to her friend holding a manila folder like it was evidence in a murder trial. She didn't speak at first, just handed the folder over and waited. Inside were 2 sheets, official documents, Seaborough City Planning and Development Department, project name Ward Wellness Resort, owner/applicant, Caleb R. Ward, property address, lot 14B, Seaborough Bluffs, construction class. New residential redevelopment. Legal owner title. Seaborough Ventures. LLC. Beneficiary parties. N.A. Signatories. Caleb R. Ward. There was no mention of Annalise. Not as co-owner. Not as trustee. Not as power of attorney. Not even as next of kin. "It's not a joint venture," Clarice said. "Not even on paper." Annalise turned to the second page, a scanned signature at the bottom, Caleb's handwriting bold and self-assured. The ink even looked smug. "I pulled the registration for Seaborough Ventures, too," Clarice continued. "It's a shell, registered out of a P.O. box in Santa Monica. No employees, no assets except that property." Caleb listed himself as sole officer and manager. Annalise closed the folder. Her movements were deliberate, slow, controlled. "He's laundering the investment," she said, voice as flat as dry stone. "He's hiding everything behind that LLC." Clarice nodded. "All the private funding, every check, every deposit, it went straight through Rebirth Ventures. That's how he kept your name out of it, and kept the resale untouchable." Annalise turned and walked to the window, the same one where Richard used to stand with his morning tea, staring into their small garden like it held the answers to life. Now all it held were weeds and an overturned pot knocked over by last night's wind. "He planned it," she said, "from start to finish. The story, the tears, the trust transfer, the LLC, the fake construction delay, all of it." Clarice didn't interrupt. She knew grief when she saw it, knew the anger that followed wasn't about revenge, but reclamation. "I need copies of everything," Annalise said, turning back. "Digital, physical, both." Clarice reached into her satchel and pulled out a flash drive. "Already done." But that's not all. She laid a second folder on the table, this one thinner but more damning. "Bank filings," she said. Melissa deposited $40,000 into their personal account from an investor check written out to Rebirth Ventures. That's embezzlement if you can prove intent. Annalise raised an eyebrow. Clarice gave a bitter laugh. "It gets better." The check memo said Phase 2 construction deposit. Caleb and Melissa used it to pay off credit card debt and book a vacation package, guess where, Greece. July. Annalise didn't blink. Her hands, though, curled into fists at her sides. She sat back down, opened her drawer, pulled out an old accordion folder labeled Trust Documents, Richard. Inside were receipts, insurance statements, copies of her driver's license, tax returns signed by both her and Richard. She began sorting them on the table like a general laying out a battle map. "Look at this." She pointed to a notarized signature from 2019 signing over power of attorney for a healthcare decision. "That's my signature. You can see the curl in the W. I always do that loop." Then she opened another drawer, pulled out a box of old checks, selected one from 6 years ago. "Same loop," she said. "Same ink pressure. Same slant. Now compare it to the mortgage doc Caleb submitted." Clarice opened her laptop, pulled up the image. They zoomed in side by side. "The spacing is too perfect," Clarice said. He traced it digitally. "It's a composite, not organic." Annalise nodded. "Print that too. Every comparison, every reference. I want 3 copies. 3. One for my lawyer, one for the DA's office, and one for Caleb when he tries to gaslight me in person." Clarice smiled, grim and proud. "You're really doing this." "I'm not surviving this," Annalise replied. "I'm ending it." She spent the rest of the afternoon gathering everything. She printed her bank statements highlighting the exact date and amount of Caleb's withdrawal. She cross-checked the LLC's articles of incorporation with the day Caleb had told her he was still brainstorming the business. She printed out her emails, her texts, even Melissa's thank you message, because gratitude when misused was its own kind of lie. Every time she uncovered another deception, she didn't cry, she didn't scream. She documented, methodically, quietly, like a woman preparing a eulogy not for the dead, but for the illusion of family she had clung to for too long. At 6:12 p.m., she stood in the middle of her dining room surrounded by piles of evidence and said aloud to no one, "You don't know me, Caleb." The sound startled her, not its volume, its clarity. "You don't know what I'm capable of. You think I'm the kind of mother who folds under guilt, who chooses silence over scandal, who'd rather be robbed in peace than confront her only son." She picked up a photo from the side table. Caleb at age 8, his hair a tangle of summer sweat arms wrapped around Richard's leg, smiling like he believed the world was made just for him. She stared at it for a long beat, then set it face down. "I raised you," she whispered, "but you don't know me at all." There was no fury in her voice, only steel, the kind of strength forged not in fire but in betrayal, in the cold clarity of realizing that love when unreciprocated becomes obligation, and obligation when weaponized becomes a prison. She walked back into the kitchen, pulled out a new folder from the cabinet, labeled it Cal, Lies, filed the documents alphabetically. Then she wrote something on the tab, not a threat, not a title, just a truth. "Everything you stole, everything I'm taking back." And she closed it slowly, deliberately, as outside the first raindrops began to fall. Gonko! The envelope was thick, glossy, and pretentious. It arrived by courier late Thursday morning, nestled inside a larger FedEx sleeve. No return address, No personal message, just gold-embossed lettering across the front. Caleb R. Ward cordially invites you to the grand opening of the Ward Wellness Resort, Saturday 2:00 p.m. Seaboro Bluffs, cocktail attire. Press coverage begins at 1:30 p.m. Annalise stared at it for a long time before setting it on the counter beside her cup of tea. She didn't touch it again. Not right away. Instead, she turned and walked to the bookshelf in the hallway, the one Richard had built from reclaimed oak during the summer Caleb broke his arm climbing trees. She ran her fingers across the spines of books, not looking for anything in particular, just needing to feel the wood under her palm. Something real. Something that hadn't lied to her. When the knock came an hour later, she didn't flinch. Clarice stepped inside, laptop in hand, her mouth tight with purpose. "He invited you too," Clarice said, nodding toward the invitation. "Special guest list," Annalise replied flatly. "Mother of the founder." Clarice dropped her bag on the table. "You need to hear this." She opened her laptop, pulled up a news release scheduled to hit the local Seaboro Tribune the next morning. Ward Wellness Resort to open this Saturday, a modern haven for restorative health. The article named Caleb as CEO and lead visionary. There were quotes about giving back to the community and providing holistic luxury elder care. It praised the oceanfront views, the private therapy suites, the state-of-the-art spa. But what caught Annalise's eye was the mention of attending VIPs, 2 private investors from New York, a local congressman, and representatives from 2 major healthcare networks. "They've spun the whole damn thing into a PR circus," Clarice said. "And once they cut that ribbon and shake the right hands, any legal battle gets way more complicated." Annalise didn't respond. Clarice sat down. "You have the documents ready?" Annalise nodded and opened a file box on the floor beside her. She pulled out 3 sets of folders, neatly labeled and tabbed. One contained copies of the forged mortgage documents, side-by-side comparisons of her signature, the notary's missing registry. The second held wire transfer receipts, LLC registration evidence, and investment fraud markers Clarice had helped identify. The third, a USB drive with Caleb's damning phone call transcribed and time-stamped. "There's more," Annalise said. Screenshots from Melissa's Instagram, vacation photos, credit card statements for furniture bought under the LLC now sitting in their home. Clarice exhaled. "That's enough to stop a grand opening." "I don't want to stop it," Annalise said. Clarice blinked. "You don't?" "I want it to happen," she continued. "I want every camera rolling, every handshake midair, every guest sipping champagne, and then when all eyes are watching," she closed the box with finality, "I'll remind my son who taught him how to command a room." There was silence. Then Clarice gave a half-smile. "Damn." They worked late into the night. Clarice formatting press kits for media outlets. Annalise printing legal affidavits from her lawyer who'd been looped in 3 days earlier and was standing by ready to act the moment the first microphone turned on. Friday passed with surgical preparation. No nerves, no second-guessing. Just a mother and her pain sharpened into purpose. On Saturday morning, Annalise laid out the black dress. It wasn't morning wear, it was armor. Simple, sleek, and tailored to fit her better now than it had 10 years ago. She pulled her hair into a low twist, applied the softest stroke of eyeliner, then slipped on the string of pearls Richard had given her on their 25th anniversary. Not for sentiment, for power. At 12:15 p.m. her taxi arrived. The driver, a young man with earbuds in, didn't speak as he helped her with the file box. He didn't ask questions when she gave him the address. She sat in the back seat, eyes forward, clutching the black leather gloves she would not wear. Her palms were already warm. As the car approached the Seaboro Bluffs, traffic thickened. A valet team in navy jackets was directing guests through the main drive. The resort looked like something from a luxury magazine, white stucco walls with glass railings, a sculpture garden flanking the entryway, and 2 massive floral arrangements spelling out Ward. "Here," Annalise said. The driver stopped beside a red carpet that stretched from curb to front doors. Reporters milled near the entrance, cameras flashing as arriving guests posed in tailored suits and pastel dresses. Clarice was already there, posing as press with a badge from the Ledger, her old column's name. When she spotted Annalise, her eyes widened just slightly, just enough for them both to know this was the moment. Annalise stepped out slowly. calm, controlled. The wind caught her dress and made it ripple like a flag. The camera flashes turned toward her almost instinctively. Someone whispered, "That's the founder's mother." A man in a navy blazer approached. "Ma'am, do you have an invitation?" Annalise handed him the gold envelope. He scanned it. "Right this way." As she entered, she heard her heels click against the marble floor. Each step echoed louder than the chatter of guests. The atrium gleamed with polished brass and soft jazz music floating from unseen speakers. Caleb was across the room laughing with a man in a cream suit and dark sunglasses, likely one of the investors. Melissa stood near the refreshment bar, her hand resting on a tray of hors d'oeuvres like she owned the building. Annalise didn't go to either of them. She walked to the front of the stage where a long ribbon had been stretched between two silver poles. A podium waited beside it, stacked with promotional flyers. Behind her, more guests poured in. The noise rose. Then came the voice she'd been waiting for. "Mom!" Caleb had spotted her. His face shifted surprise, then discomfort, then a carefully assembled smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, approaching. Annalise gave a tight smile. "You invited me." "Well, yes, of course." He glanced around, suddenly aware of the crowd forming cameras, turning guests curious. "We're about to start the ceremony. Want to sit up front?" She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the room. "Actually, I was hoping for a moment at the podium." Caleb blinked. "What?" "As the founder's mother. It would mean something." He hesitated. "This is kind of a tight schedule." "Just 2 minutes." The way she said it, steady firm, made his jaw twitch. He nodded. "Sure, of course." She climbed the steps. Clarice stepped toward the back, camera in hand, recording. A man announced her, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, a few words from Annalise Ward, mother of the founder." The room applauded politely. She stepped up, straightened her spine, and took the microphone. "Thank you for having me today." Her voice carried, clear, steady. "I've watched my son build things since he was a boy. Tree forts, science projects, dreams. I've watched him succeed, and I've supported him every step of the way." She paused, took a breath. "And I'm here today to continue that support in the form of truth." The room stilled. Caleb's face tightened. She reached into her bag, pulled out a stack of folders, raised them high. "These are documents showing that this property was funded with forged signatures, stolen retirement funds, and false statements made to private investors. My name appears on a mortgage I never signed. My trust account was drained without consent. And this LLC, this resort, was built not on integrity, but on manipulation." Gasps, murmurs. A few camera shutters clicked faster. Caleb stepped forward, alarmed. "Mom, what are you doing?" Annalise held up a flash drive. "This contains a recorded phone call. My son discussing how he deceived me, how he planned to sell this very building for personal gain." The man in the cream suit turned, stared at Caleb. Annalise locked eyes with her son. "You said I wouldn't cause a scene, that I didn't want drama." Her voice didn't tremble. "You were wrong." She turned, handed the flash drive to a nearby journalist. "This is your story now," she said. "Tell it well." Then she stepped down, walked through the crowd as silence bloomed like thunder. Behind her, a world began to crumble, and ahead of her, for the first time in months, freedom. Caleb stood at the podium like a man born to be admired. The early afternoon sun spilled golden light across the marble steps of the Ward Wellness Resort, making the ocean beyond shimmer like liquid glass. His tailored navy suit hugged his frame with surgical precision, and the soft glint of his cufflinks caught the attention of every lens in the crowd. A line of guests sat before him in rows of white chairs, tied with pale green sashes. Investors, health executives, city officials. Behind them, local reporters clustered under a press tent, microphones and cameras, all trained on the charismatic founder. He adjusted the mic with ease, smiling as he began. "Today marks the culmination of vision, perseverance, and the desire to give back to the community that shaped me." Click, flash, click. "We envisioned a place where wellness isn't just treatment, it's dignity. A space where our elders can age not in silence, but in serenity." The crowd nodded, some even murmured in agreement. Melissa stood off to the side near the refreshments, smiling and nodding with perfect poise. A woman from the Tribune took notes furiously while a cameraman zoomed in on Caleb's face as if capturing greatness in real time. Caleb turned slightly, his hand gesturing gracefully toward the building. This resort isn't just a structure. It's a promise, one that says we can do better for our parents, our grandparents, for the people who raised us with everything they had. More applause. He paused, smiled just long enough to let the sincerity sink in. And Stop! The voice rang out clear and cutting like glass shattering over velvet. Heads turned instantly. Guests twisted in their seats, confused. The camera operator swiveled the lens toward the center of the courtyard. Annalise Ward stood alone halfway up the stone aisle. She was dressed in black, elegant, commanding, not mourning but deliberate. In her hand she held a leather file folder raised high like a flag of war. Caleb froze. His smile twitched. Rehearsed charm faltered. "Mom." Annalise didn't blink. Her voice didn't waver. "I said stop, before you add one more lie to this performance." Whispers broke out across the courtyard. Melissa's wine glass trembled in her hand. One of the New York investors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The congressman's aide picked up his phone, already typing. Annalise stepped forward slowly, deliberately, like each footfall was a verdict. "I have something to say," she announced. Caleb cleared his throat, trying to regain footing. "We can discuss this later, Mom. We're in the middle of—" "No, Caleb." Her voice was steel. "You're in the middle of fraud." Gasps, audible. The cameraman surged closer. She turned to the crowd. "My name is Annalise Ward. I am the mother of this man, Caleb Ward, and I am also the victim of an elaborate betrayal." She opened the folder, removed a stack of documents. Her movements were practiced now, measured. Her voice carried like a seasoned orator in a courtroom. 6 weeks ago, I authorized a temporary trust transfer under the belief that my son was building a healthcare facility for the elderly. She held up the first page, a wire transfer receipt. He said he was struggling financially, that his wife was unwell, that his vision needed one final push. He cried. He begged. I gave him $97,000 from my late husband's account. The Tribune journalist stopped writing and simply stared. Then I discovered he'd used my signature forged to secure a mortgage loan for $250,000 using property he inherited from his father but never told me about. The same property you're all sitting on right now. She turned, handing a packet to the nearest reporter, then another to a stunned investor. These are notarized documents showing my name on legal files I never signed. A comparison of signatures from past financial records proves they were digitally traced and fraudulently submitted. The crowd was frozen. The congressman's aide now had the phone to his ear. Caleb's lips parted, then shut again. "I also have a voice recording," Annalise continued, now pulling out a small USB drive from her folder, "of Caleb admitting he planned to sell this property, this resort, for private profit under the guise of elder care, using my money, my trust, and my silence." The man in the cream suit, the largest investor, rose from his seat. "You've got what now?" he asked. "A recording," Annalise said, "of your visionary here laughing about how easily he manipulated his old lady mother." Clarice, positioned beside the press tent, held up a small portable speaker. "Would you like to hear it?" "Play it," someone said. Caleb stepped forward, suddenly, eyes wild. "Mom, don't do this." "You did this," Annalise said, locking eyes with him. "And now you're going to watch it unravel." Clarice hit play. Caleb's voice filled the air, casual, confident. "She has no idea we're planning to flip the property." I stuck with the wellness pitch. She ate it up. Loud murmurs erupted. Melissa took a step back, her face pale. "If we close by July, the bonus clause kicks in." "Jesus," the cream suit investor muttered. "Honestly, the old lady doesn't want drama. She just wants peace and sympathy. I give her both." That line landed like a punch in the lungs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Phones lifted, recording everything. One of the cameras live streaming the event caught Annalise in perfect profile, standing tall, stoic, resolute. Caleb looked cornered. His eyes darted to Melissa, who refused to meet them. He turned back to his mother, desperation blooming. "I was going to fix it. I just needed—" "No," Annalise said. "You needed to be stopped." One of the resort staff approached the podium, whispered something to Caleb. He waved him off, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the truth. The lies were collapsing too fast to control. The congressman was gone, his chair empty. The investor walked up to Clarice. "I want copies of everything." "You'll have them by end of day?" she said, slipping him a card. Someone asked, "Is she pressing charges?" Annalise turned toward the question, her voice calm. "Yes. I've already retained counsel. The forged documents. The financial misappropriation, the use of false pretenses for investment. Every charge that fits will be filed. Caleb's face twisted into something unrecognizable. Not guilt, not shame. Fear. "Mom, please." It was small now, weak. But she wasn't. Annalise stepped closer, looked him in the eyes. The same eyes she used to wake up early for, pack lunches for, bandage knees for. "You stole my name," she said quietly. "Now you'll watch what I do with yours." And with that she turned, walked through the parting sea of guests and cameras. Her heels clicked with finality, each step echoing across the courtyard like a gavel falling. Behind her, Caleb stood frozen in a suit that no longer fit him. And ahead of her, the truth, loud, undeniable, and finally free. The courthouse smelled like old paper and dusted stone. It always did, no matter how new the paint or polished the floors. There was something in the air that reminded people why they were there, truth on trial. Annalise sat in the front row of the gallery, spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore gray this time, not black, not mourning. Gray was neutral. Gray was steady. Her eyes were fixed on the man seated at the defendant's table. Caleb. His suit was more wrinkled now, his hair slightly disheveled, no cufflinks. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Caleb didn't respond. He didn't look back at the gallery either. He hadn't dared meet his mother's eyes since the day she walked out of the grand opening and set the truth on fire in front of a dozen cameras. The courtroom murmurs dimmed as the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Latham, a no-nonsense woman with decades in financial crime, entered in full robes and took her seat with the efficiency of a surgeon. The proceedings began. Prosecutors moved quickly. Their case was clear-cut. Unauthorized wire transfer of nearly $100,000 from a trust account. Forged mortgage application bearing a false notarized signature. Fraudulent LLC filings for Seaborough Ventures. Use of deceptive statements to lure investor funds. Each point landed like a blow, and each time a document was held up, Annalise felt the knot in her chest loosen just a little. But it wasn't enough, not yet. After 2 days of testimony from handwriting experts, digital forensics analysts, and investor statements, the prosecution called its final witness, Ms. Annalise Ward. She rose without hesitation. Clarice was in the gallery, too, a small notebook in hand. She didn't write yet, just watched closely. Annalise took the oath, stepped into the witness box, and looked directly at the jury. 12 strangers, 12 potential believers. She didn't speak with anger. She didn't cry. Her voice was low, measured, deliberate. "My husband and I spent over 30 years saving for our retirement. He passed away suddenly earlier this year. A week later, my son Caleb Ward called me in tears." She paused. Let the weight of that word settle. Tears, she repeated. "He said he was building something meaningful, a wellness center for the elderly. He said he was struggling, that his wife was sick. He told me they were close to losing everything." Her throat caught for just a second, but she steadied herself. "I gave him access to our trust. I signed temporary authority over because I believed him, because I raised him, because I loved him." She looked toward the defense table, but Caleb kept his eyes down. "What I didn't know," she continued, "was that the very same day he took that money, he also forged my signature on a mortgage loan. Used property that legally belonged to our family to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars, created a company under false pretenses, told investors stories tailored for their wallets, lied systematically and strategically, not just to me, but to everyone." The courtroom was silent. "I wasn't just betrayed," she said. "I was erased from the paperwork, from the vision, from the truth." One juror wiped her eye. "I'm not here for vengeance. I'm not here because I want to see my son suffer. I'm here because I need the law to acknowledge what happened. Because if we allow family to become the loophole for justice, then none of us are truly protected." She nodded slowly. "Not even from our own blood." The prosecutor said no further questions. The defense declined to cross-examine. As Annalise stepped down, the entire room shifted. The power in it changed. Clarice was already writing. The deliberation lasted just over 3 hours. When the jury returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on 3 counts of financial fraud, 1 count of document forgery, and 1 count of abuse of fiduciary trust. The judge reviewed the sentence carefully. It was not jail time, not formally, but it wasn't mercy either. Caleb was ordered to pay full restitution of $97,386 to Annalise within 6 months, pay an additional $35,000 in penalties to the investor group, serve a 5-year probationary term under financial monitoring, and perhaps most symbolically was legally stripped of all claim to the Ward estate retroactive to Richard's date of death. No inheritance, no access to family trust or properties, the judge stated. This court recognizes the emotional and financial damage done not only to your mother but to public trust at large. Caleb stood visibly shaking. The bailiff led him out of the courtroom, not in cuffs, but in disgrace. Annalise didn't watch him go. She turned instead to Clarice, who met her gaze with something between pride and pain. Outside the courthouse, the light had changed, not brighter but cleaner. A small crowd of reporters gathered near the steps. Clarice didn't push Annalise toward them. She knew her friend had already spoken the only truth that mattered under oath, under pressure, under God. But Clarice had her own voice. 3 days later, her article went live. The Ledger. The Mother Who Wouldn't Stay Silent, by Clarice V. Monroe. It began with, some betrayals happen in darkness where secrets fester unseen. But some betrayals are lit by cameras and microphones staged under banners that say wellness while hiding rot beneath. This is the story of a woman who chose not to bow her head or close her eyes. This is the story of a mother who dragged the truth into the light and dared it to be seen. The piece went viral, not because of drama, but because of clarity. It quoted Annalise's courtroom testimony. It listed the charges, the investors who withdrew the haunting detail of a signature that wasn't hers. But it ended with something even sharper. Blood may bind us, but trust is earned. And when that trust is broken, when a mother becomes collateral in her son's ambition, the law must not hesitate to act. Annalise Ward didn't speak for vengeance. She spoke for everyone who's ever been betrayed in the name of love. And this time, justice listened. When Annalise read the article, she didn't cry. She folded the newspaper, slid it into a file folder, and labeled it with a single word: closure. The ocean hadn't moved. That was the first thing Annalise noticed as she stepped out of the car and onto the stone drive of the once dammed property. It shimmered just beyond the horizon, indifferent to everything that had happened. To the lies, the court, the betrayal, even her son's absence. The sea just kept being the sea, wild, cold, and impossible to tame. She stood before the whitewashed facade of what had once been the Ward Wellness Resort, the name now stripped from the banner pole. The stylized gold lettering had been pulled down the week after the verdict, leaving behind screw holes and a faint outline on the wall like a ghost of ego that refused to die quietly. Annalise held the keys loosely in one hand. Not Caleb's keys. Not keys passed through inheritance or guilt. These were hers now legally, permanently. Transferred back through a court order backed by law, sealed with a judge's signature and a mother's unforgiving clarity. The resort hadn't opened. Of course it hadn't. Construction had halted the day after her public declaration. Investors pulled out, the PR team disappeared, the staff went unpaid. By the time Caleb's probation officer showed up, the place was already falling silent. But Annalise hadn't walked away. She hadn't sold the property. Realtors had called curious and opportunistic offering figures she might have once found tempting. She listened to them all, smiled politely, and then hung up, because she had other plans. She pushed open the front door and stepped into the empty lobby, the scent of paint still faint in the air. The floor was pristine marble sunlight streaming across its polished surface like a second chance. Dust had settled in the corners, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt waiting. The next 2 months moved like the turning of a tide, slow at first, then all at once. She kept the core design, the natural light, the coastal glass, the minimalism. But the expensive lounge chairs were sold off. The spa wing was repurposed into consultation rooms. The overpriced imported rugs were traded for clean, sturdy flooring. She hired contractors, not the ones Caleb had used, but people Clarice recommended, honest, local, meticulous. What rose from the ashes wasn't a resort. It was a refuge. A month later, Clarice arrived with the brass plaque in her hand, fresh from the engraver. Together they mounted it just beside the entrance. Trung tâm ánh sáng, a lighthouse for trust. Free legal aid and emotional support for elders affected by familial abuse. Đừng để lòng tin bị đánh cắp. Annalise ran her hand over the final line as it caught the sun. The words were hers, the pain behind them real, the message no longer whispered behind closed doors, but chiseled in public for all to see. Within the first week, 5 people called. The first was a retired librarian named Elsie. 74, quiet, her voice shaky over the phone. She came in the following Tuesday, sat across from Annalise in a simple chair in what used to be Caleb's executive lounge, and held her purse with both hands like it was the last thing in the world she could control. "My nephew," she said, "took my pension checks, said he'd pay my bills. I didn't notice for a year." Annalise listened, took notes. Clarice connected her to a pro bono attorney through their newly formed Elder Justice Network. By Friday, the bank had frozen the nephew's access. The second was a man named Harold, a former mail carrier. His daughter had convinced him to sign over the deed to his home just to simplify estate planning, and then threatened to evict him when he questioned how she spent his savings. He sat with Annalise for nearly 2 hours, crying only once when she told him he wasn't crazy for expecting kindness. Then came more. A woman whose son had taken out loans in her name. A grandfather whose grandson used his car title as collateral for a crypto investment. A widow scammed into handing over life insurance money to a cousin who promised to double it. They came quietly, humbly, sometimes accompanied by shame, sometimes by fear. But they left with something they hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. The walls of the center slowly filled with soft light, photos of elders with their advocates, quotes typed and framed from those who had survived betrayal, a corkboard near the front desk filled with thank you notes in shaky cursive. Every morning, Annalise unlocked the door at 8 a.m., sharp brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and placed 2 ceramic mugs on the reception counter, one for her, and one for whoever needed a place to finally speak. She didn't ask for donations, but people gave what they could: a tray of muffins, a handmade quilt, a handful of change in an envelope marked for the next woman. Sad. Some days were hard. Sometimes the stories echoed her own so closely that her fingers went numb. But she never turned anyone away, never rushed a word, because she remembered what it had felt like to be alone in a house filled with betrayal, to question your own instincts, to look at your child and wonder who they had become. She knew that pain intimately, but more importantly, she knew what came after it. One crisp October morning, Annalise stepped out onto the back patio with a cup of tea, watching the waves crest and crash against the shore. The sea still hadn't changed, still wild, still untamed. But this time she didn't resent its distance. This time she understood it. Some things were never meant to be controlled. She was joined a moment later by Clarice, who handed her the morning paper. The front page held a small headline above the fold: "New Legal Center Offers. Hope for Victims of Financial Abuse." Beneath it, a photo: Annalise standing beside the engraved sign, one hand resting over the phrase she had lived into existence. Clarice smiled. "We made the front page." Annalise nodded. "Good." Clarice took a sip of tea. "Do you ever think about selling now? Moving somewhere warm, a smaller place?" Annalise shook her head slowly. "This is warm enough," she said. "This is small enough." They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Clarice whispered, "You're turning pain into shelter, you know." Annalise smiled faintly, eyes still on the sea. "No, I'm just making sure no one else has to pour their trust into a black hole." And from the way the light stretched across the tiled floor behind her, it was clear something in this place had shifted. No longer a monument to deception, now a sanctuary. From the ashes she hadn't just rebuilt, she had reclaimed. It arrived on a Monday. Mondays at the center were always quietest. The weekend cases had been documented, phone calls made, lawyers assigned. There were no seminars scheduled, no intake appointments before 10. Just Annalise alone in her office, reviewing last week's handwritten letters from 2 new clients, both grandmothers, who had been helped out of their homes by their adult sons. The morning sun spilled sideways across the filing cabinets, catching flecks of dust that danced like they had all the time in the world. The kettle on the side table whistled softly. She reached to turn it off when Maya, the volunteer intern from the community college, tapped on the glass. "You've got a postcard," Maya said, holding up a worn rectangle of cardboard. "No return address, just this." Annalise took it and turned it over. The front was simple. A photograph of the Sierra Nevada foothills sunset, catching the ridges in burnt orange shadow, cutting the valleys into dark seams. The back was filled with unmistakable handwriting, slanted slightly forward, still legible despite the tight spacing. She sat down slowly, tea forgotten. Her hands trembled slightly, but not with fear, with memory. The message was short. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. You don't owe me anything. I used to think I was the smartest person in the room until the room turned on me and showed me how far I'd fallen. It's strange how quiet it gets when no one believes you anymore. But maybe that's what I needed. Silence. The kind that forces you to listen to your own voice and realize how poisoned it's become. You were right about all of it. Thank you for standing up to me, for stopping me, for making sure I couldn't go any further. I'm learning how to be a person again, not a persona. You may never call me your son again, I get that. But I wanted you to know you changed the story. Not just mine, yours. Caleb." She stared at the last line for a long time, not because she didn't believe it, but because for the first time in nearly a year his voice didn't feel like a weapon. It didn't offer excuses. No manipulations tucked between the syllables, no guilt-laced questions, just honesty. Brutal, raw honesty. She hadn't cried when the court ruled. She hadn't cried when she was handed the deed. She hadn't cried when she mounted the plaque or painted over the wall where Ward Wellness had once hung. But now, in the quiet of a Monday morning, with a postcard still warm from the postman's bag, the tears came, silent, steady. They rolled down her cheeks, not like grief, but like release. She didn't cry for Caleb. She cried for the mother she used to be, the one who said yes too quickly, who confused loyalty with silence, who gave her signature without reading the fine print, because she believed love couldn't forge lies. She let that mother go now, not with regret but with grace. She folded the postcard once carefully and tucked it into the drawer beside the legal folders. Not to preserve Caleb's words, but to remember the sound of her own heart finally still. The door chime rang at the front desk. Maya called out, "Mrs. Ward, we've got someone." Annalise stood and wiped her cheeks. No need for explanation, no need to hide. She walked down the hallway, past the framed thank you notes and newspaper clippings, past the mural a volunteer had painted, a lighthouse rising from crashing waves, warm light stretching across a storm-black sea. At the front door stood a man in his late 70s, corduroy jacket, cap in his hands, shoulders slightly bent but eyes alert. His voice was soft. "I heard someone here might know what it's like." Annalise smiled, not because she was healed, but because she had rebuilt. She extended a hand and gestured him inside. "You heard right," she said. "Come in, we've got coffee and time." And as the door closed behind them, the sea kept moving steady as ever. But inside the center, the tide had turned, and no one would drown alone again. 3 months later, the garden was in full bloom. Annalise stood at its edge where the sun filtered softly through the canopy of pepper trees, casting dapples of gold across the stone path. The early morning was quiet except for the hum of bees and the soft rustle of breeze against rosemary. The light had that early autumn gentleness, the kind that wrapped itself around your shoulders rather than beat down from above. This corner of the center, the garden, had once been Caleb's planned outdoor spa space. He'd wanted plunge pools and massage tables and a juice bar for detoxing executives. Now there were flower beds, fruit trees, and 3 benches painted by retired artists from the local community. It was the part of the property Annalise had taken most personally. She'd pulled weeds with her own gloved hands, planted lavender in silence, laid stone pavers in the dirt. She never rushed it. Every seed felt like a vow: I will not let what was broken define what becomes. A soft chime rang behind her, the old brass bell Clarice had installed by the front gate. Someone had arrived. But Annalise didn't turn immediately. She let the sound drift across the garden, watched how the light bent around the wild sage. This was her ritual now. This was her rhythm. She no longer lived in reaction. She lived in choice. Voices in the distance. Maya's laughter, the sound of chairs being moved in the seminar room, the clink of ceramic cups in the kitchenette. Life had found its way back in, and in the center of it so had she. From this angle, the garden looked like a courtyard in Tuscany, but better because it had cost no illusions, just sweat and truth. She reached down, picked up a fallen sprig of thyme, and rubbed it between her fingers. The scent rose instantly green, sharp, alive. A door creaked behind her, and Clarice stepped out onto the deck. "You hiding?" she teased, sipping from a white enamel mug. Centering, Annalise replied, eyes still on the branches overhead. "Same thing," Clarice said, then came to stand beside her. "They're all asking when you'll come in and speak. Let them wait a little longer." Clarice didn't argue. She just sipped and watched the light move with her. 3 months, she said finally. "Feels longer." "Feels earned," Annalise replied. They stood that way for a moment, two women who had watched the worst kind of fire and decided to grow something from the ash instead of fleeing it. "I think," Annalise said, voice quieter now, "what no one tells you is how lonely it is to win." Clarice looked over. "You don't feel vindicated?" "I do," Annalise said. "But vindication isn't warmth. It's survival. The warmth comes after, from the rebuilding, the morning coffee, the way Harold brought in a basket of lemons from his new place, the letters, the quiet." Clarice nodded. They heard laughter from inside. A woman in her 60s with a purple scarf was telling a story to two others on the bench near the hallway window. The topic, no doubt, was heavy, but the laughter still came, a kind of joy born from shared hurt. Annalise let the sprig fall from her hand. "I had to become someone else," she said, "not just to hold him accountable, but to save myself. That's the part no one writes down in court records, what you lose in order to stay standing." Clarice placed a hand gently on her friend's shoulder. "But you are standing." Annalise turned at last and looked toward the doorway. Inside, a new day waited. More names, more stories, more healing, and still she remained whole. She took a breath, one so full it felt like it filled the ocean behind her. Then in a voice neither loud nor weak, she began to speak. "It's strange," she said, "how betrayal doesn't break you all at once. It chips away, quietly, until you look down and realize you've hollowed out the best parts of yourself to make room for someone else's damage." Clarice didn't interrupt. She knew better. "But the moment you name it, the betrayal, it shrinks. It loses its power. Because now it has form, it has edges, and you can walk around it, examine it. Decide whether it belongs in your story." She turned fully to face her friend now. "I gave Caleb 30 years of my life, and then one very long year of letting go." Clarice nodded. "And what's next?" Annalise smiled. Now I plant." She stepped forward back into the hallway, the warm wooden floors creaking beneath her feet. Every framed letter on the wall, every story of someone who had once been swallowed by silence, was a mirror of her own journey. As she passed the front desk, Maya handed her a visitor form. "She's in the back," Maya whispered, glancing toward a quiet room. Annalise nodded, glanced at the name on the form. Dolores H., age 79. Concern financial coercion by adult daughter. Another woman, another chapter, another version of the same song. She walked down the corridor, hand brushing against the wall where the lighthouse mural stood. The words Clarice had painted underneath had never faded, not even once. "Let this be the place where silence ends." She pushed open the door to the consultation room. The woman inside looked up anxious. Annalise smiled gently. "Hi, Dolores. I'm Annalise. Come, let's talk." The woman relaxed slightly. Her eyes darted to the lighthouse etched into the glass panel behind the desk. "It's beautiful here," Dolores whispered. "It's honest," Annalise replied. "And that's rarer." Outside, the garden bloomed. Birds called across the treetops. The light shifted, and above it all, a voice. Annalise's voice carried like wind across an open field, narrating the truth she had earned with blood and breath. Being betrayed by someone you love is the deepest kind of hurt. But standing up alone if you must and claiming your worth again, that is the greatest victory. As the camera pulled away from the center, rising over the tiled rooftops, across the waving trees, and toward the horizon, where sea met sky, the final words appeared in simple, steady text. "Love fiercely, but never blindly. Trust is a treasure, guard it well. Fade to light, fade to peace, fade to beginning.